It is a privilege and not a right for somebody to immigrate into the United States, and that needs to be done on our terms. There was a self-deportation flight. It wasn't going to Mexico or Latin America, it was going to China.
What would you say is broken about our current criminal justice system? How would you reform it?
The left will say that poverty causes crime. The reality is crime causes poverty. I do think that there is a severe problem with political violence. There was a poll that showed that almost half of people who identify as left of center thought that assassinating President Trump could be justified.
And welcome back to the Brief Insights from the Inside. We are joined today by Congressman Brandon Gill. Congressman Gill represents Texas's 26th congressional district. He is both one of the youngest members of Congress, and he serves as the president of the freshman Republican class. Congressman, thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So before we get into the specifics, I want to just talk big picture for a moment. We are on track for the longest government shutdown in American history. Can you give us some updates? What is it going to take to reopen the federal government? Can Democrats in any bipartisan fashion work with the Republicans on getting the government back open again?
Well, the ball is in the Democrats' court here. Listen, let's take a few steps back and realize how we got to the position that we're in right now. We've known that there was a government funding deadline at the end of last fiscal year for a long time. We've known it all year, and that was September 30th. We've known that we have to do something to keep the lights on in the federal government, pass a continuing resolution being the most likely. Now, what Republicans in the House did is we said, let's just pass a 7-week continuing resolution that will simply keep the lights on. We're not going to add in Republican or conservative priorities. We're not going to do any of that. It's just going to be an extension of funding for 7 weeks to make sure that hopefully we have enough time to run the regular appropriations process, which is how the government is supposed to be run, where you have 12 individual appropriations bills where Congress can actually do its job and actually go through line by line and determine where we want federal dollars to go. Now, that's Congress's primary constitutional authority, is to exercise the power of the purse. So that's what we said. We said, let's get back to that. That's called regular order. Let's get back to regular order. And all we need is a 7-week continuing resolution to do that. Now, we passed a clean continuing resolution, meaning none of our priorities, because we knew that's something Democrats have voted for in the past. They voted for it 13 times during the Biden administration. They voted for it earlier this year in March. So we said that is something that should be palatable to them. So we sent that over to the Senate, and all of the sudden, Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, decided we are going to vote no. We're going to shut the government down by Democrats' choice. Because what do they want? They want health care for illegal aliens. They want funding for NPR in PBS and left-wing state-sponsored media. And they want funding for left-wing social programs. And we said, listen, we can have debates about where the government money should be going, or what all of these debates should actually look like. But let's keep the lights on first and do it in a responsible way. And Democrats said no. So this is entirely a Democrat shutdown. And again, the ball is in their court. We sent them a clean continuing resolution, something they voted for in the past, and they are choosing to shut the government down in order to bring in totally unrelated policy ideas. Remember, all it takes is 7 Democrats in the Senate to vote yes to keep the government open, and they won't even do that. So I hope that we can get out of this soon, but it doesn't look like right now Democrats are willing to come to the table at all.
Right. And that's the critical point. Have those debates, have those negotiations, but do so while the government is open. You've been very vocal about this, but one of the consequences of a government shutdown, obviously, is federal employees are not paid. Certain House Republicans are floating the idea of suspending congressional pay for members of Congress while the government is shut down. Is that something you would support?
Oh, absolutely. I've already signed a letter and turned it in a couple weeks ago saying that, stipulating that I will not get paid until the government gets reopened. So I think that's something we definitely should do. But I've already agreed to that. And by the way, most of my Republican colleagues, if not all of them, have done the same thing.
Right. So I want to go to the breaking news of the week. We have seen Jay Jones, who's the leading nominee for Attorney General in Virginia, the Democratic nominee, talking about fantasizing killing the children of his political opponents. But we've also seen, not that I'm necessarily drawing a comparison, but we have seen the young Republican group chat being leaked talking about, their love for Hitler, the N-word, the F-word. Where do you see in American political culture violence playing out. Is this something that is sustainable? Is this something that can be reformed or fixed? Is this a problem that is just on the left? What is your take on the violent rhetoric that is so often leading to actual violence in the streets?
Yeah, first of all, I'll say it's not sustainable, I don't think. And I do think that there is a severe problem with political violence in the United States, but that's a problem that does come from the political left. And it's not just Jay Jones, this attorney general candidate who, to your point, is fantasizing about killing his political opposition, hoping that his political opponent's children would die because in his mind, that will help change policy. I mean, that is so disgusting and dark for somebody who's running to be the one of the leading law enforcement people in Virginia as attorney general. And by the way, after those texts were released, Jay Jones has not lost a single major endorsement from any Democrat. He's endorsed by multiple members of Congress, multiple leading political officials in Virginia. So clearly, they're not too disturbed by this kind of rhetoric. If you think about political violence, of course, it is always wrong, no matter what side of the aisle it comes from in any way. But there is a systemic problem on the left. And you can look at even polling data. It's not just Virginia. It's not just the Charlie Kirk assassination, as we know, or the assassination attempts against President Trump, or the two Israeli diplomats who were murdered in Washington, D.C. earlier this year by pro-Palestinian activists. It's not just that. Polling data shows that there's much stronger affinity for political violence on the political left. There was a YouGov poll that came out about a month ago, and it showed that about 25% of people, survey respondents who identify as very liberal, believe that political violence can be justified. Now, that number was 3% for people who identify as very conservative. 3% is far too many. They don't have a place in the party or the movement. We completely reject political violence, but 25% on the left represents a systemic problem that they need to deal with. And you've seen that in other polls as well. Earlier this summer, there was a poll that showed that almost half of people who identify as left of center thought that assassinating President Trump could be justified in some way. So this is a problem that the left needs to seriously deal with because that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate your unequivocal rejection of political violence and wish that there were more policymakers who would be able to say that as well. I believe that when I conceive of your tenure in Congress and when most Americans conceive of your tenure in Congress, there are basically two words that come to mind, and that is immigration and crime. I think that is probably your bread and butter issue. You're really interesting for a bunch of reasons. One of them being you talk about not just the need to deport illegal immigrants, which most Americans, by all public opinion data, would say, yes, we believe in that. But you also believe in the need to limit legal immigration as well to the United States. Can you talk about why that's such an important issue and why should the American people care about legal immigration?
Sure. And you know, we've talked so much about illegal immigration, first of all, because that has been sort of the main problem in the United States. We've had a border crisis even long before Joe Biden was in office. It just got far, far worse under his tenure because he intentionally invited millions of people, probably more than 10 or 15 million people, to come into the country illegally. So that's where most of the focus has been. And President Trump has done so much to largely solve that problem. Within only a few weeks of coming into office, it has been nothing short of just phenomenal to see the work that he's done, and we need to make that permanent. And we tried to do some of that in the tax bill that we passed earlier this year. But legal immigration is something we need to start tackling as well. You know, one of the main problems that I see with legal immigration is twofold. One of them is that we're allowing a large number of people to come into the country legally, to upward over 1 million a year, and we're not really determining who we want to come into the country to begin with. It's done via diversity lotteries and visa lottery systems and things like that, or via chain migration, which is where somebody comes into the country and then they bring their parents and then their parents' brothers and then their parents' brothers' children and on and on and on in an unlimited chain. So we have large numbers of people coming in where we're not really determining who these people are or whether their culture is compatible with our culture, whether they actually benefit the American people, the people who are living here right now. And that's something that has to change because that causes long-term problems in the United States. And I think over time, it begins to seriously tear our social fabric apart. So this is something we need to be talking more about, and we need to see policy reflect the priorities and the interests of the American people.
Right. And you were one of the reasons that the Big Beautiful Bill was passed. One of the provisions, of course, is this unprecedented $50 billion funding for ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. Now, most Americans would say if you're an illegal alien and you committed an assault, a felony, you're violent, then yes, you should be deported, no questions asked. Yet you sort of take it a step further and you say, well, any illegal immigrant, by virtue of being an illegal immigrant in this country, needs to be deported as well. Again, can you explain to the American people or respond to the critics on the left who would say that's not necessary?
Well, first of all, I would say that one, if you came into the country illegally, you should know that you are subject to deportation. By virtue of coming in here illegally, you've already broken our laws. So, you'll hear people talk about the left. These are people who haven't broken any of our laws. They're here. They're just, trying to work and get a job or whatever. Well, just the fact that they're here is a violation of our laws to begin with. But if you go a little bit further than that, again, we want to be able to determine who comes into our country. I was at DFW, which is an airport, a major international airport just close to my district, Dallas. And as I was touring DFW, we happened to go to a terminal to just check things out, see how things were going, and get a little bit of a tour there. And what was happening, and it wasn't planned, was that there was a self-deportation flight. It wasn't going to Mexico or Latin America. It was going to China. We've allowed thousands, if not tens of thousands or millions of people from hostile foreign nations to come into our country. That undermines our national security. It undermines the American interest, and it's something we've got to take seriously. But let me give you a couple other problems since you asked. One of them, and this is one of the big defenses of illegal immigration, has to do with labor force.
Yeah.
Well, whenever you bring in large numbers of largely unskilled laborers, that depresses working class wages in the United States. It's a simple supply and demand issue. Whenever there's a large supply of unskilled labor, the cost of that, the price of that labor goes down. And for the past several decades, you've seen working class wages be stagnant at best in the United States, sometimes declining on a real basis. That shows you that illegal immigration has real impacts. Whenever illegal aliens are coming in and they're taking jobs that otherwise would have been filled by the American people,
Right.
American citizens, that's a problem. I'll give you one other example, is cultural incompatibility. And that's something that we should recognize, that we have an incredible culture in the United States, that all of the benefits of America, the free market, which is great, the great education system, great social services, all of that sits upon a cultural foundation at its core. And that cultural foundation is undermined whenever you bring people in who are incompatible with that foundation. You see that with some of these Islamic cities that are popping up in Texas, for instance, where you have large numbers of people coming and immigrating specifically here with the intention of not assimilating to our culture, but creating Islamic subcultures, which will adhere to Sharia law, that's another subject, but entirely incompatible with the West. And that is a problem, and that is unsustainable, and we've got to deal with it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Sharia law. One of the things that I think you and other House Republicans do really well when it comes to immigration is you don't just talk about the practical consequences, but whether it be security or pragmatic economic consequences, you talk about these cultural changes about the makeup of the United States. And the Department of Homeland Security and really Secretary of State Marco Rubio have been really focused, certainly since October 7th and since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that if you're a student on a foreign visa or if you're applying for a green card into the United States and you talk about ideals or issues that are vehemently anti-American or go against ideals of Western civilization, then we just don't want you in this country. And so I guess my question is where do you see this line between preserving and upholding American values, what it means to be an American, and then those on the left who will say, well, you're simply curtailing free speech and everyone has a First Amendment right to say whatever it is that they would like?
Well, I would start by saying that if you are a legal immigrant or somebody who is here on a visa, particularly a student visa, being in the United States is a privilege. It is not a right. It is something that we have allowed you to do. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to come into our country and enjoy this great education system, our college system, which has a lot of problems, but is still one of the best in the world, you need to bring values that are beneficial to the United States, not come into the United States with the explicit intention, as you've seen with so many of these student activists, particularly the pro-Hamas ones, of undermining Western civilization, undermining the very culture that is created and allowed you to come in and benefit from the cultural values that we have. So it is a privilege and not a right for somebody to immigrate into the United States, and that needs to be done on our terms. We've got to come back and realize that if we want all of these benefits to last, if we want to live in a country that values law and order, that has great social services, that has a stable social and political system, we cannot import people who are undermining all of that, who are coming in here and with the intention of causing problems. And that's I think that's a simple proposition, and that's something that most Americans would agree with.
Yeah. So let's talk about law and order. One of the things that Charlie Kirk often spoke about, which ruffled some feathers, but I think he was absolutely right, was we actually needed more mass incarceration, and that when criminals commit crimes, it shouldn't exactly be rocket science. They should end up incarcerated.
What is so wrong with mass incarceration if the only way to be incarcerated is to commit a crime?
There's nothing wrong with mass incarceration. In fact, we need more prisoners in this country, not less prisoners, and we let prisoners out of jail way too quickly in America.
So I guess what would you say is broken about our current criminal justice system? How would you reform it?
Yeah, there's this idea from the left. The purpose of the justice system should be to reform or rehabilitate them. In other words, this is somebody who committed a crime because they're impoverished or because they came from bad circumstances or something else. The reality couldn't be further from the truth. The left will say that poverty causes crime. The reality is crime causes poverty. I mean, that's a truth that we should focus on and remember. But the purpose of our justice system is not to rehabilitate criminals. It's to give criminals their just deserts, what they deserve for the crime that they committed. So I think that, if you have somebody who is murdering somebody else or carjacking, stealing their car, or breaking into somebody's home, that person should be locked up. Again, that's something that most Americans agree with, because it is Americans have a basic sense, a very strong sense of basic justice. And you violate that whenever you have liberal DAs in the United States, or left-wing jurisdictions that are willing to take criminals who have committed heinous crimes and give them a slap on the wrist and throw them back out on the streets to commit more. If you look at most major cities in the United States, whether it's New York or Chicago or Washington, D.C., a place where I spend quite a bit of time now, most of the crimes, probably 50% or more, are committed by a small number of repeat offenders who are arrested. Then they're not charged. They're not put in jail. They're instead thrown back out on the streets, and they go out and commit more crimes. And that's one of the things that has turned our major cities into hellholes. And it's simply left-wing jurisdictions that will not uphold the law as it's written in the laws that are on the books.
Well, as someone who's speaking to you from one of those hellholes known as Los Angeles, I completely concur. When you go back to your district, you ran for the first time on President Trump's agenda, whether it's border security, whether it's tariffs or cutting costs. Yet because you mentioned the judicial activists on so many of these courts and these benches, how do you plan on delivering the MAGA agenda when it seems from an outside perspective, so much of that agenda that you were elected to do is consistently being derailed by these unelected judges?
It's a major problem. The left has embraced judicial activism for decades in the United States. They've created this new intellectual movement that the Constitution should mean whatever some random judge believes it should mean, that it's a living document, meaning it means whatever the left wants it to mean at any given moment. But what you've seen during this Trump administration has been particularly egregious. You've had judges, as President Trump is trying to reform the military, which operates under the executive branch, or fire federal workers who are wasting tax dollars or doing things that directly undermine the national interest. You've had judges stepping in and step on the president's plenary constitutional authority as commander-in-chief of the United States. So one of the things that I did earlier this year, back in March, was I filed articles of impeachment against Judge Jeb Boasberg, who's a district court judge out of D.C., who demanded that President Trump turn a plane full of Tren de Aragua terrorists that he was deporting, turn this plane around midair and bring them back into the United States. That was a gross overreach of his authority. It was a politicization of the courts, where you have judges like Judge Boasberg trying to directly undermine the Trump agenda that he was elected to do, that he has constitutional authority to do. So that was one of the major steps that I took just this year to help fight back against judicial tyranny. But we passed the No Rogue Rulings Act out of Congress earlier this year as well, which would limit the ability of a district court judge to issue a nationwide injunction. So there are things that we are working on here. But judicial activism and judicial tyranny is a serious problem in the United States.
Congressman, you've given us a lot to think about, and full disclosure, I should have opened with this. My brother and in-law, they are not only voting at the ballot box, they're voting with their feet, and they actually live in your congressional district as of 2 years ago, and they're loving it. I think there's a reason why Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the nation. We really appreciate your time and everything you're doing for the American people on Capitol Hill.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.